The purpose of this video is to educate the viewer on how to achieve a flawless surface on your sculpture. I will supply you with the proper tools, materials, and techniques for working in plaster. There are several benefits for putting your sculpture into plaster. The white of the plaster can reveal many imperfections in surface quality. This process can take much longer up front, but will save countless hours and dollars when reproducing your sculpture. Putting your work into plaster will also aid in evaluating compositional flaws. A plaster record will help your work and aid artisans when reproducing, whether it be bronze or stone. All molds leave seam lines. You want to evaluate the seam where the seam lines are. Those will be the first things that you'll go ahead and chisel off the seam lines and use a file and sandpaper to smooth out the seam lines. You'll also want to flatten the base. So we begin by doing the basics first. By flattening the base, I'll use an orbital sander and see where the high points are. I have found the high spot, marked it, and with the 60 grit hook and loop orbital sander, I try to remove the high spot. I'll use a square to find the high spot, and since it's very dusty, I'm using a dust extractor and keep rechecking. Now, for the first time, I'm going to take what we call a traveling light to reveal the surface flaws on the sculpture before I ever touch it. I hold it from several angles in several different directions, and you can see flaws that you never thought you ever had. They may be minute, but they are there. They can be there. So you want to examine with this traveling light and look use different directions to see where the flaws are. You can see tiny little shadows in the work. This will let me know what direction to start working. I want to use the tools that will least affect the plaster. I want to do as little as work as possible. So I'm using a wire tool, a combination of wire tool and files and sandpaper to level out the line. Now I adjust the lighting so that I can work along the edge of the light and see what surfaces are higher or lower from the mold issues. This also allows me, while I'm working slowly, how I'm going to chop this up to make a production mold out of it. Now I notice that the box is not entirely square, so I put my level up and draw a line to square out that area of the box shape. It just seems to be bulging a little bit too much, so I'm going to draw that line and then take that area out. Another advantage of having it in plaster. After I reduce and level the seam line, I then look along the edges of the fabric, the edges of the body, find the edges, and I clean up the edges with a file and a clay tool I want to minimize the amount of work ahead with the gesso, so I do as much work before I apply the gesso. After I have leveled the sculpture with the files quite a bit and worked, I use sandpaper to get the waves out of the plaster. I get the sheetrock sandpaper from Home Depot. Does a good job not clogging up the sandpaper. This is one of the most tedious parts here, is you want to get the waves out, and the only way you can get the waves out is with the sandpaper. Just a lot of work. Now, in combination with the jeweler's file and sandpaper, I go back and forth and really work the surface. I use my drafting brush to brush the plaster off the sculpture so that I don't create a big cloud of dust around me. Another reason for working in plaster is you can put the work at angles that you could not previously work in the clay without damaging it. So up here I'm getting the feet and the underside of the legs a lot better than I could with it just on a board. I'm using a Milani riffler here. I'm checking the flatness with the pencil, seeing those high spots, and I'll be taking it out with the riffler. This is get the Milani rifflers. They're the best. They're sharp. Don't get the ones at Home Depot. They won't work. You might try your local woodworking place. They might have a good riffler. I haven't had too much luck without ordering them from an international source. This is a wax scraping tool that I got from the Complete Sculptor. I find this tool is one of the best tools for working in plaster and working with marble. And it allows you to really get a nice crisp edge and take off a lot of material, and where the bigger tools just don't quite do the job. Look how beautiful that tool works. Now I'm using a combination of these very sharp loop tools that I get from Axner clay supply or Laguna clay supply. This is a pottery tool, and it's rigid. It will take a lot of pressure without bending, and it's nice for getting those beautiful shapes of the hair. This is what I mean by working the edges with the jeweler's file, where two forms meet the block against the fabric. Now I'm going to start doing my patching and repair work. I'm mixing about half and half plaster to gesso. The trick to gesso is to put it in the water first, just like plaster. So I'm going to use a popsicle stick and add the plaster, emptying the water just a little bit, giving a little less water, and putting equal amounts of plaster and gesso into the water. After I add the plaster, I add the gesso and stir. After the gesso has been completely absorbed and is a paste-like consistency, then I add the white Elmer's glue. The white Elmer's glue is a hide glue, virtually the same properties as a rabbit skin glue. Rather than going through the whole process of making the rabbit skin glue, I find that Elmer's glue is a little easier to use. You want the white Elmer's glue. Another thing, the rabbit skin glue tends to have a hardness to it. So for purposes of gesso, I avoid using the original rabbit skin glue for the gesso. Another tool I find useful applying the plaster is a piece of a Bondo scraper trimmed off with a razor blade. As I start working the big rough areas, I reduce the amount of plaster in the mixture and increase the amount of gesso in the mixture. What's important is the amount of glue to gesso. Water is irrelevant as to the amount of water. It's the glue to whiting that is critical. Over the entire surface of the model. This will allow me to get a good thick layer of gesso on. Now with the gesso applied, I start looking at the edges, crispening up some of the edges. You can see how they're not quite so crisp. I'm using again another one of those wax scrapers from what's the name? The Sculpture Supply Complete Sculpture in New York. I'm going to refine the fingers, put in the fingernails, and since I lost them in the waste mold process, I'm going to add a lot of delicacy to those. Now I have taken some 80 grit sandpaper and glued it to a popsicle stick. What I do is I take a section about 4x4 and spray glue to the back of it, then apply popsicle sticks to the sandpaper and then cut them out individually with a razor blade. This makes for a very convenient sanding tool without wearing your fingers out. Now in combination with the sanding stick, the jeweler's file, and the wax scraping tool, I model on the hair. I want to get all the lumpiness out, get nice smooth curves, and you have to plan to spend quite a bit of time on this. Now the gesso can be of various hardnesses, so I make the gesso about medium hard here so that it's not impossible. Too soft, it will crumble and flake off. Too hard, it just becomes unworkable. So you have to have those glue measurements just right. Again, I can emphasize that having your work in plaster and working at different angles is very convenient. Plaster is not as convenient as clay, it's harder to work. But I can put it at different angles and get areas refined otherwise that I couldn't get in the clay. And if you get it figured out at this stage and get it those surfaces just right, then you save a lot of potential clobbering by a clumsy foundry worker. After I've built up the areas like the fingers that have been damaged and the toes that have been damaged, I use mostly gesso and glue mixture to do the repairs. But like for instance the face, the more detail I get into, the smaller and sharper the refining tools, so I can get the exact detail in the face and in the fingernails and in the hair and around the edges. And this is a combination of working back and forth with little squirrel hair brushes, adding plaster and gesso in small, minute amounts to little areas to build them up. Now, in case you get a break, as I have here, you can glue it together. What I do is I glue one area of the break and the other area, let the glue dry, and then I apply a fresh coat and then glue them together. But to prevent cracking further on down the road, if this is going to be a display piece, I apply silk. Now you have to use pure silk on this. You cannot use any other thing other than organic pure silk, and one that is very transparent that will wet out in the glue. So I cut the silk and apply it to make sure that it will fit, and then trim it a little bit more if I need to. Then I go ahead and I apply the Elmer's glue to the joint where the patch is going to be, and then wet it out with an ample amount of glue. So I apply the glue first. After I've applied an ample amount of glue to the joint, I go ahead and I lay the silk on top of the broken joint. And then paint a layer of glue on top of that. This way, if you're going to gild it and put all the time into it, you won't have a crack there. If you go ahead and this is going a little far afield, but if you're going to take it to the gilding stage where you're going to apply gold to it, you want to do this, or there will come a time when there's a crack will show. So you have to apply silk to those cracks. The glue to gesso proportions are the same for the brushable as for the sprayable mixtures. The only thing that will change will be the quantity of water. Now, the first thing I do, again, is the secret of this, is to apply the gesso to the water directly. Let the gesso be absorbed by the water. Then you can add your glue. Now, I always use about 1/3 part glue to 3 parts gesso. That seems to be good for me. It doesn't hurt to take notes and find out what's good for you. Now, for the sprayer, I use a latex sprayer that I got at Lowe's. It allows me to spray thicker coats of paint. So I'm able to adjust the water. I use about 1-to-1 part water to the gesso, and then 1/3 glue to the mixture. And again, the glue is the last thing you add. I like to spray 8 to 12 coats of gesso. Try not to get it to drip. You'll have drips occasionally. You'll have to adjust the pressure on your gun. Now, in between the coats, I like to put the second coat, or the following coats, on right before it is completely dry. You want to have it a little bit moist when you apply the second coat. That will prevent delaminating. Let's see. So in between the coats, it's important to rinse out your sprayer and just put your gesso in another container. Now, the glue will have a tendency to separate out of the gesso, so you want to mix your gesso before you put it back in the sprayer. Now, as in the beginning, I use my traveling light to look for flaws. You can see where I've been able to remove many of the flaws. And I'll move the board around and use a side light. This traveling light is important to get. Now we see we've got a perfection of the surface. I neglected to mention earlier that I also use a combination with fine steel wool. I'll start out with a single-aught steel wool and end up using the 4-aught steel wool. This will save you a tremendous amount of time in being able to get all those surface textures. But you have to use the sandpaper first to get the waves out. Here I am using the steel wool.